Hello everyone. Welcome to Nightmare Horrors. Thank you for joining us for another episode of true scary horror stories to help you relax and fall asleep. I know this story is meant to help you fall asleep, but before that, please make sure you like the video and subscribe. Without further ado, let's dive right in. Lay back, relax, and enjoy. Midnight is an hour unlike any other. It does not arrive gently, nor does it leave without taking something with it. Midnight waits. It does not rush, it does not falter, and it does not care who you are. It simply comes. And when it does, the world as you know it changes. There's something about the darkness at that hour. It isn't just the absence of light. It's something far more deliberate. It feels alive, doesn't it? Pressing in from every corner, thick, heavy, suffocating. It settles over you like a second skin, and no matter how brightly you burn the lights, no matter how loudly you speak, or how hard you try to ignore it, it knows you're there. A pause. The faint sound of a clock ticking echoes softly in the distance. Each tick grows louder, sharper, cutting through the silence like a blade. They say midnight is a threshold, a moment balanced precariously between the day that was and the day yet to come. But what no one tells you is that thresholds are dangerous places. They're not meant to be lingered on. They're unstable, vulnerable. They are cracks in the fabric of what we call reality. And in those cracks, things move. Things that do not belong to the world of sunlight and reason. Things that wait for the fragile boundary of midnight to weaken, just enough. You might not notice it at first. Perhaps it's just a flicker in the corner of your vision, a shadow that doesn't quite make sense, or the way the air feels suddenly colder, even though the windows are shut tight. Maybe it's the faintest sound, a whisper so soft you almost convince yourself you didn't hear it at all. Almost. But it doesn't stop there, does it? No. Midnight is patient. It gives you time to notice. Time to realize you're not as alone as you thought. The whispers in the background grow louder, still unintelligible, but persistent, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. Imagine this. You're sitting alone, late at night. The world is silent, except for the soft ticking of a clock nearby. You glance at it. The hands hover over 12. You tell yourself it's just a number, just another moment, like any other. But then you hear it, the chime. 1, 2, 3. And as each note strikes, you feel it, don't you? The way the air seems to shift. The way your own heartbeat grows louder in your ears. You glance at the clock again, and that's when you see it. The hands aren't moving anymore. They're stuck, frozen at 12. And yet, the ticking hasn't stopped. If anything, it's getting louder. It doesn't make sense, but you tell yourself it's fine. It's just a malfunction, a quirk of an old mechanism. And then you notice something else. The shadows. They're wrong. They're too long, stretching across the room in ways they shouldn't. They flicker, even though nothing else is moving. And that's when it hits you. Something else is in the room with you, watching. The ticking grows faster, more erratic. A low hum begins to swell, almost like breathing. You try to shake it off. You tell yourself it's your mind playing tricks on you. The stress of the day, the loneliness of the night. But deep down, you know better. This isn't imagination, it's presence. You try to ignore it. You try to stay calm. But the harder you try, the more you notice. The whispers are louder now. They almost sound like words, though you can't quite make them out. The shadows stretch closer, darker, deeper. And the clock, it won't stop ticking. Faster and faster, until it's no longer counting seconds, but something else entirely. And then you feel it, that unmistakable sensation that you are no longer alone, that someone, something, is standing just behind you. You want to turn around. Every instinct tells you not to, but you can't help yourself. Slowly you turn, and there's nothing there, at least, not at first. The ticking stops abruptly. Silence fills the space, heavy and oppressive. Then faintly, the sound of footsteps echoes. But midnight isn't done with you. It never is. Because midnight isn't just a time. Midnight is a question. It asks, what will you do when the light fails? When the shadows press closer? When the line between what is real and what is imagined no longer exists? And here's the thing. Midnight doesn't care about your answer. It doesn't need permission. It only needs time. And once it has you, it doesn't let go. So I'll ask you this. If you knew the darkness was alive, if you knew it was watching you, waiting for you, would you still sit there alone as the clock strikes 12? Would you still tell yourself it's just a trick of the mind, just a coincidence, just a shadow? Or would you finally understand? Midnight isn't just the end of a day. It's the beginning of something else. The faint sound of a door creaking echoes, followed by a whisper, a single word, clear and cold. Stay. For Lisa, the library was more than a job. It was a refuge, a place where time felt slow and the world quieted down enough for her to think. Late nights were her favorite. Long hours in the dim glow of reading lamps, surrounded by shelves heavy with stories. The silence after midnight had always felt like her own secret, a peaceful calm that belonged only to her. But tonight, the silence was different. It wasn't soft or comforting. It was heavy, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. She tried to ignore it, brushing it off as exhaustion, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer alone. A pause. The faint sound of footsteps echoes, slow and deliberate. She first noticed it around 12:10. Or was it earlier? She couldn't quite say. It started small, almost imperceptible. A faint shift in the air, as though someone had walked past her. She told herself it was nothing. The old building was full of drafts after all. It groaned and sighed like an old man settling into a chair. But deep down, she knew it wasn't the building. Something was off. Her desk lamp flickered once, just for a moment. The light settled, but not completely. It seemed dimmer now, like the shadows around her had crept just a little closer. She glanced at the clock on the wall, expecting to see the usual rhythm of seconds ticking by. But the hands weren't moving. They were frozen, perfectly still, both pointing straight up at 12. The ticking of a clock grows louder, irregular, each tick resonating unnaturally. The clock's face seemed wrong somehow, but she couldn't put her finger on why. She stood up, staring at it, willing it to start moving again. And that's when she heard it. Faint, deliberate footsteps coming from deep inside the library. She froze. She was certain she had locked the doors hours ago. No one else was supposed to be here. The sound was soft at first, like bare feet on polished wood. Then it stopped. Lisa told herself it was nothing, just her imagination playing tricks on her in the stillness of the night. She tried to sit back down, to focus on the stack of books she was sorting. But then the sound came again, closer this time. The sound of footsteps echoes louder, deliberate, pacing slowly toward her. Her breath quickened. She grabbed the flashlight she kept on her desk, her fingers trembling slightly as she flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the shelves. Everything seemed normal. Rows of books, the faint outline of the exit sign at the far end of the building. But the feeling wouldn't leave her. That nagging, unshakable certainty that someone else was here, watching her. She called out, her voice low, tentative. "Hello." The word hung in the air, unanswered, swallowed by the silence. Then came the chime. The clock on the wall, frozen at 12 Isar, began to strike. 1, 2, 3. Each chime was louder than the last, ringing out like a bell in an empty cathedral. She turned back to it, her flashlight beam shaking as it landed on the unmoving hands. The chimes didn't make sense. The clock wasn't working. Its hands were still frozen in place, but the sound kept coming. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. The chime fades, leaving an eerie stillness. A faint whisper rises, too quiet to understand. Lisa stood there, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline, her heart pounding in her chest. She told herself to calm down, to stop overreacting. But the whispers had started. Faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from every corner of the library. She turned toward the sound, shining her light into the shadows, but there was nothing there. Her pulse quickened as she moved down the aisles, her flashlight beam dancing across the rows of books. And then she saw it, a single book lying on the floor, open as if it had fallen from the shelf. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the flashlight. The book hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. A faint thud echoes, as if something shifts just out of sight. She knelt down, her hand trembling slightly as she picked up the book. Its pages were yellowed with age, the text faded and uneven, and scrawled across the open page in jagged black letters were the words, "Midnight is where it begins." Her breath caught. She stared at the words, her mind racing. What did it mean? Why was it here? The whispers were louder now, surrounding her, filling her ears with their rhythmic cadence. And then she noticed her shadow. The sound of the whispers distorts, merging with the faint hum of a growing vibration. At first, it seemed normal, just her own shadow, stretching across the floor in the faint glow of her flashlight. But then it shifted. It moved, and not with her. Her body froze, every muscle tensed as she watched the shadow ripple unnaturally, its edges warping like ink in water. When she turned her head, it didn't follow. It stayed still, rooted to the floor, like it belonged to someone else entirely. A long pause. The whispers stop abruptly, replaced by an eerie hum. Lisa stumbled backward, her flashlight beam darting wildly. Her shadow snapped back into place, aligning with her movements, but the damage was done. The air around her felt charged, electric, as though the entire room was holding its breath. And then she heard it, her name. It was faint at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. A voice, low and hollow, whispering her name from the darkness. She spun toward the sound, her flashlight shaking as it illuminated nothing but empty shelves. The voice came again, louder this time, layered and distorted, as though it was being spoken by more than one person. Lisa. Her grip on the flashlight tightened as she backed away, her heart pounding in her ears. She turned toward the exit, her mind screaming for her to run. But as she did, something caught her eye. Far down the aisle, in the deepest shadows of the library, a figure stood, motionless, watching. Cut to black. The sound of the clock ticking resumes, slow and deliberate. Midnight had chosen her. Lisa's first instinct was to run, to leave the library, to escape the suffocating weight of the stillness that clung to her like a second skin. Her steps were hurried, uneven, the flashlight trembling in her grip as she moved toward the front doors. They weren't far. She could see the faint outline of the glass panels glinting in the dim light, promising an exit, an escape. But as she reached them, something stopped her. Not physically. No chains, no locks. The doors were clear, unobstructed. But when she pulled, they didn't budge. She yanked harder, her fingers slipping on the cold metal of the handles. Nothing. They were unyielding, as if welded shut by some invisible force. And that's when she noticed it. The clock on the wall above the doors. It was still. Its hands hadn't moved a fraction since she last checked. Midnight. It wasn't passing. Midnight wasn't just an hour anymore. It was a place, and she was trapped inside it. A pause. The sound of the clock ticking grows slower, heavier, like the beat of a faltering heart. Her breathing quickened. She pounded on the doors, shouting for help into the empty streets outside. But her voice didn't carry. It sounded small, muted, swallowed by the glass. She turned back toward the library, her flashlight casting jagged shadows across the room. And that's when she saw it for the first time. A symbol faintly etched into the wood of the nearest bookshelf. A crescent moon, its curve sharp and unnatural, like a blade. She brushed her fingers over it, the grooves cold beneath her touch. It wasn't the only one. As she shone her light down the rows of books, more symbols revealed themselves, an open eye, unblinking and watchful, and a single word, carved into the wood over and over again. Awake. The whispers return, faint and layered, as though coming from the very walls. Her heart raced as the word burned itself into her mind. Awake. The meaning was clear, though she didn't want to admit it. This place didn't want her to rest, to stop, to let her guard down. Whatever had her here wanted her awake. She moved through the aisles, her footsteps uneven and hurried. The symbols were everywhere, carved into the shelves, scratched into the floorboards, even faintly scrawled on the spines of the books themselves. They seemed to follow her, as if leading her somewhere. And the clock, its ticking had changed. It was slower now, each tick dragging out unnaturally long. The sound felt mocking, deliberate, like it was laughing at her helplessness. The sound of ticking warps, distorting into an unnatural rhythm, growing louder and slower with each beat. She caught a glimpse of herself in the glass of a nearby window, her flashlight beam reflecting her face back at her. But something was wrong. She stepped closer, her breath fogging the surface. The reflection didn't move as she did. Her expression was different. Eyes hollow, face gaunt, skin pale as if drained of life. It stared back at her, unblinking, accusing. And then it moved, not like a reflection, but like something alive. Its hand reached toward her, pressing against the other side of the glass. She stumbled back, the flashlight dropping from her hands, its beam spinning wildly across the room. When she looked again, the window was empty. She told herself it wasn't real, that none of this was real. But even as she tried to convince herself, she could feel the weight of the library pressing in on her. The air was thick, suffocating. And the symbols, those damn symbols, seemed to glow faintly in the corner of her vision. The whispers grow louder, forming faint words that dissolve before they can be understood. Lisa's movements became frantic. She needed answers, something, anything to explain what was happening. Her feet carried her to the restricted section, a part of the library she rarely entered. The air was colder here, the shadows darker, She shone her light across the shelves, her fingers brushing over the spines of old, forgotten books. And then she saw it. A journal. Its cover was cracked leather, its spine barely holding the pages together. It looked out of place, resting on a pedestal in the center of the room. She picked it up, her hands trembling as she opened it. The handwriting inside was uneven, frantic, as though the writer had scrawled the words in desperation. Narration shifts, as though reading from the journal. Midnight isn't an hour. Midnight is a prison. It doesn't let you go. It keeps you here, awake, afraid. It feeds on you. The shadows are alive. They're watching. They're waiting. If you're reading this, don't fall asleep. Don't let it take you. Midnight is where it begins. Midnight is where it ends. Lisa's breath caught as her eyes fell to the final entry. The ink was smudged, the letters uneven, but the meaning was clear. Don't fall asleep, or it will take you too. Her hands trembled as she closed the journal, the whispers rising around her once more. The library felt alive now, its shadows moving, stretching, shifting with every flicker of her light. And deep in the distance, beyond the rows of shelves, she could feel it. Something watching, something waiting. Midnight wasn't just holding her here, it was hunting her. The sound of the ticking clock slows to a stop, replaced by a deep, resonant hum. The whispers grow louder, overlapping into an unintelligible cacophony. She had entered the library alone, a place she thought she understood, but now she wasn't so sure. Midnight had become something else, a living, breathing entity, and it had no intention of letting her go. Lisa had stopped trying to understand. Logic, reason, the rules of the world she thought she knew, they had all abandoned her. Midnight was no longer a moment. It was a labyrinth, a living, breathing maze that stretched endlessly around her, pulling her deeper with every passing second. Or was it even passing? She wasn't sure anymore. The clock on the wall still read 12. It always read 12. The sound of the clock ticking resumes, slower than before. Each tick reverberates, unnaturally deep. She clutched the journal to her chest like a lifeline, the cryptic warnings inside echoing in her mind. Midnight is a prison. She had read the words over and over, their weight sinking into her chest. But what haunted her more were the rules. They were scratched into the pages, their meaning stark and cold. Stay in the light. Do not answer when it calls your name. If you see the clock move, run. Her flashlight flickered as if in response, the beam struggling against the encroaching dark. She had always taken light for granted, its constant presence, its comfort. But now she realized the light wasn't just a convenience. It was her shield, the only thing holding back the shadows that whispered her name. The whispers return, faint but deliberate, calling out, "Lisa." She spun around, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The shadows weren't still anymore. They moved, slow and deliberate, stretching across the floor like living things. They whispered her name, the sound layered and distorted, as though coming from 100 mouths at once. Lisa. Her breath caught. She gripped the flashlight tighter, her hands trembling. The journal's words pounded in her head. Do not answer when it calls your name. But the voice was so close now. It came from everywhere, wrapping around her, crawling under her skin. Her lips parted before she could stop herself. "What do you want?" she whispered. The shadows stopped. A long pause. The ticking of the clock halts. Silence fills the space, suffocating and heavy. For a moment, the world seemed frozen. Then, slowly, The shadows began to shift again, pooling together in the far corner of the room. Lisa's flashlight flickered, the beam dimming as the darkness grew thicker, heavier, as though it was being drawn towards something unseen. She backed away, the journal clutched tightly in her arms. And that's when she saw it, a new shadow, taller than the others, standing upright, watching her from the far side of the room. It didn't move, it didn't whisper, it just stood there waiting. The sound of distant footsteps begins slow and deliberate, moving closer with every beat. Lisa turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to move. The library seemed to stretch endlessly around her, the aisles of books twisting and shifting, leading her deeper into the darkness. And then she saw it, a staircase leading down. She didn't remember it being there before, but she didn't have time to question it. The footsteps were louder now, echoing through the empty halls. She gripped the railing, descending quickly, the air growing colder with every step. The sound of her footsteps fades as the hum of the basement grows louder, vibrating through the space. The basement was different. It didn't feel like the library above. The walls were made of stone, rough and uneven, and the air was damp, heavy with the scent of earth. Her flashlight beam danced across the room, illuminating old, forgotten furniture and stacks of dusty books. And then she saw it, a door. It was small, almost hidden, its surface worn and splintered. Above it, written in faded chalk, were the words, "Face it or stay forever." Her breath caught. The words were simple, but their meaning was clear. This was it, the answer she had been searching for, the way out. But what would she have to face? The whispers grow louder, overlapping until they form a single resonant word. Choose. She reached for the door, her fingers brushing against the rough wood. Her flashlight flickered violently, the beam almost extinguished. Behind her, the footsteps had stopped. She didn't need to turn around to know that something was there, watching her, waiting for her to decide. The journal's warnings echoed in her mind. The rules were simple, but they had kept her alive this long. Stay in the light. Do not answer when it calls your name. If you see the clock move, run. But now there was no light, no clock, only the door and the thing behind her. She had no choice but to step through. The sound of the door creaking open echoes, followed by the faint sound of her breath catching as she steps forward. Lisa crossed the threshold, the darkness swallowing her whole. She didn't know what waited on the other side, only that staying wasn't an option. Midnight had trapped her, hunted her, toyed with her, and now it was forcing her to face whatever lay beyond the door. The library fell silent as the door closed behind her. The clock on the wall began to tick once more, its hands slowly creeping forward. Midnight had passed, but for Lisa, the nightmare was only beginning. The ticking of the clock fades, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that grows louder until it abruptly stops. Midnight has its rules, and breaking them always comes with a cost. Lisa's descent into the basement was slow, every step weighed down by the thick, oppressive air. The stone walls seemed to close in around her, the narrow staircase twisting deeper and deeper into the earth. Her flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely piercing the darkness, as though the very shadows were consuming the light. She couldn't tell how far she had gone. The library above felt like a distant memory, its quiet halls replaced by a suffocating silence that seemed alive. And then, as she reached the bottom step, she felt it. An unmistakable presence, vast and ancient, pressing down on her chest like a great unseen hand. She wasn't alone anymore. The sound of faint whispers returns, layered and distorted, building in intensity. The room was vast, far larger than the space above should have allowed. The stone walls seemed to stretch into infinity, their surfaces slick with moisture that glinted faintly in the flickering light. In the center of the room, the shadows were gathering. They moved like liquid, flowing toward a single point, twisting and writhing as they pulled together. The air grew colder with each passing second, the temperature plummeting to the point where her breath fogged in front of her. And then, from the swirling mass of darkness, it began to take shape. The sound design grows more intense, a low, resonant hum punctuated by the faint sound of something shifting, scraping against the stone. The shadows pull together, forming limbs, a torso, a head. The figure was humanoid, but only barely. Its body was an absence, a void darker than the surrounding blackness, its edges flickering and unstable. And its eyes, hollow, glowing orbs that burned with a cold, piercing light. They fixed on Lisa, unblinking, and she felt her knees weaken beneath their gaze. For a moment, nothing happened. The figure simply stared, its presence filling the room, suffocating her with its weight. And then it spoke. A deep, resonant voice echoes through the space, impossibly layered, as though 1,000 voices were speaking in unison. "You shouldn't have come here." Lisa stumbled back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The voice wasn't loud, but it resonated deep within her, vibrating through her bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a force, an invasion that made her feel small, insignificant. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat. The figure moved closer, its form shifting with each step, as though it was barely holding itself together. And then the room began to change. The hum shifts into a distorted melody, and faint, fragmented sounds emerge. Laughter, crying, whispers of familiar voices. The walls of the basement melted away, replaced by scenes Lisa recognized but didn't want to see. Her childhood home, dark and empty. The library, twisted and decayed, its shelves collapsing into ash. And then, her. Lisa saw herself, older, her face hollow and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. The figure spoke again, its voice calm but dripping with malice. "You've been here before, haven't you? You just don't remember." She shook her head, trying to deny it, but the scenes around her continued to shift. Memories twisted into nightmares, her parents turning away from her, their faces blank and lifeless. Friends she hadn't seen in years, screaming her name as they faded into the dark. Every fear she had buried, every regret she had tried to forget, laid bare before her. The whispers grow louder, overlapping into a cacophony that threatens to overwhelm. Lisa fell to her knees, her hands clutching at her head as the visions consumed her. The figure loomed over her, its glowing eyes unrelenting. "You don't belong here," it said, "but you have a choice." The voices stopped, the visions faded, leaving only the figure and its burning eyes. Lisa looked up, trembling, as it leaned closer. "Stay," it said, its voice low and deliberate. "Become part of this, part of the midnight. You'll never be alone again." She recoiled, shaking her head, but it continued. "Or leave. Take this with you. Carry it into the light. But know this, if you go, you'll never escape. You'll spread it. To everyone you touch, everyone you love. Midnight will follow you, always." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Lisa's mind raced. She could feel the truth in its voice, the inevitability of its offer. There was no escape, not really. Only a choice between two prisons, one eternal, and one that would consume everything she held dear. The room grows deathly silent. The figure straightens, its glowing eyes fixed on her, waiting. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the weight of its presence pinned her to the floor. Her flashlight flickered once, then went dark. She was alone in the shadows, with nothing but the figure and its unspoken demand. "Choose," it said, the word reverberating through her like a tolling bell. Lisa closed her eyes, her hands trembling as she tried to decide. The darkness around her seemed to breathe, pressing closer, waiting to devour her no matter what she chose. Midnight had caught her, and it would never let her go. The sound of the clock ticking resumes, faint but steady, as the screen fades to black. And as the clock struck 12, her decision was made. Lisa's breath was shallow, her pulse hammering in her ears as the weight of the entity's words hung in the air. The choice it offered was no choice at all. To stay was unthinkable, but to leave, to carry this curse into the world, was an unbearable burden. Yet she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She couldn't stay here. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. The entity tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. The shadows around it surged, rippling like liquid, and the temperature in the room plummeted. "You've chosen poorly," it said, its voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the walls. And then the world began to change. The sound of a low, resonant hum fills the space, overlaid with the distant ticking of a clock, growing faster and louder. The room around her twisted, the stone walls warping and stretching into impossible angles. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the stones falling away into a chasm of blackness. She stumbled backward, clutching her flashlight, its beam flickering wildly. The library above was no longer as she remembered. The shelves stretched impossibly high, their contents shifting and writhing as though alive. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark, rhythmic energy, and the doorways that once led to safety now opened only to more darkness. Lisa ran. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound bending and warping around her as she darted down one corridor after another. Every turn brought her back to where she had started. The doors led to the same room, the same shadows, the same haunting glow of the clock frozen at 12. The ticking grows deafening, overlapping with faint whispers that rise and fall like a wave. She stopped, gasping for air, her flashlight beam shaking as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. And then she saw it, a mirror, tall and ornate, standing in the center of the room. It hadn't been there before. Its surface shimmered faintly, reflecting the distorted library around her. Lisa approached cautiously, the whispers growing louder with each step. Her own reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. It moved slower than she did, its eyes wide with terror. As she reached out to touch the glass, words began to etch themselves into the surface, the letters forming as though carved by an invisible hand. "The light will guide you." She froze, the meaning sinking in like a lifeline tossed to a drowning swimmer. The light, her flashlight. It was the only weapon she had, the only thing keeping the shadows at bay. Her reflection nodded once, its movements jerky and unnatural, before fading into the dark. The sound of the whispers intensifies, joined by a low, guttural growl that seems to emanate from the shadows. Lisa didn't have time to think. The shadows were closing in, their tendrils reaching out toward her, writhing and twisting with malicious intent. She turned the flashlight on them, the beam piercing through the darkness like a blade. The shadows recoiled, hissing as though burned, and Lisa seized her chance. She moved quickly, using the light to carve a path through the twisting halls. The shelves around her groaned and shifted, collapsing into piles of ash as she passed. The ticking of the clock grew louder, each strike vibrating through her chest, urging her forward. The sound of her footsteps grows frantic, overlaid with the distorted ticking and the hissing of the shadows retreating. Finally, she saw it, the main entrance. The glass doors stood just ahead, their surface shimmering faintly in the dim light. But something was wrong. The doors were no longer clear. Beyond them, the night sky stretched endlessly, dominated by a single symbol, the crescent moon, glowing pale and sharp like a sliver of bone. Lisa hesitated for only a moment. The shadows were surging behind her, their whispers now a roar. She raised the flashlight, its beam flickering as it cut through the darkness, and ran toward the doors. The closer she got, the heavier the air became. It pressed against her like a physical force, each step harder than the last. The clock struck loudly, its chime reverberating through the room as the glass doors began to crack, spiderwebbing under the pressure of the dark. With one final burst of strength, Lisa reached out, her fingers brushing the door handle. The light from her flashlight flared, blinding and brilliant, and the shadows screamed as they dissolved into nothingness. The sound of shattering glass echoes, followed by a deafening silence. The doors swung open, and Lisa stumbled out into the night. The air outside was cool, still, and unnervingly quiet. She turned back toward the library, expecting to see the entity, the shadows, the twisted halls. But the building was dark, silent, empty. Above her, the crescent moon hung low in the sky, its glow unnaturally bright. It seemed to watch her, its curve sharp and unforgiving. And then the clock struck again, one final chime that echoed through the empty streets. The ticking of the clock fades, replaced by the faint sound of Lisa's breathing. Lisa stood there trembling, her flashlight still clutched tightly in her hand. She had escaped. The midnight loop was broken. But as she turned away from the library, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The light had guided her, but the shadows, they had followed. And as the clock's final chime faded into the night, Lisa realized one simple truth. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Lisa stumbled out of the library, the heavy doors swinging shut behind her with a final echoing thud. The air outside was sharp, cold enough to sting her lungs. Her legs felt weak, trembling with exhaustion and fear, but she forced herself forward, one shaky step after another. She had done it. She had escaped. The clock had struck 12:01. Midnight had passed, but something was wrong. A faint breeze rises, carrying with it a sound, the soft ticking of a clock, faint but persistent. The streets were empty, unnervingly so. Not a single car, not a single light in the windows of the surrounding buildings. The town, usually quiet, now felt abandoned, hollow. The stillness was absolute, a silence so deep it seemed to press against her ears. And then there was the moon. It hung impossibly low in the sky, a crescent of pale light that seemed far too close. Its curve was sharp, its glow cold and unnatural, casting long shadows across the empty streets. Lisa stopped, her chest tightening as she stared up at it. The moon wasn't supposed to look like that. It wasn't supposed to feel like it was watching. The ticking grows louder, echoing faintly from somewhere in the distance. She turned, slowly, her eyes drawn back to the library. The building stood in complete darkness, its windows black and empty. But then she saw it, a figure faintly illuminated in the pale moonlight. It was her. Lisa froze, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the figure in the window. It was unmistakably her own reflection, but it wasn't moving as she was. Its face was pale, drawn, and its eyes wide with terror. It pressed its hands against the glass, as if trapped, its mouth moving silently, desperately, as though trying to scream. Lisa's hand instinctively tightened around the flashlight, the cold metal slick against her palm. She wanted to look away, to run, but she couldn't move. Her reflection's eyes seemed to bleed with her, begging her to understand something that her mind refused to grasp. The sound of the ticking clock swells, becoming sharper, more insistent. And then it happened. The reflection began to fade, its edges dissolving into the darkness, leaving only the empty window behind. The building stood still, silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But Lisa could feel it. The weight of the library, the presence she had escaped, still lingering just beyond the glass. She stepped back, her legs unsteady, and turned away. The ticking followed her, faint but constant, each beat a reminder of what she had left behind. The street stretched endlessly before her, bathed in the eerie glow of the crescent moon. As she walked, the sound of her own footsteps seemed too loud, too deliberate, echoing unnaturally against the silent buildings. And though she tried to focus on the horizon, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were following her, shifting just out of sight. The ticking slows, each beat resonating like a heartbeat. Lisa didn't look back again. She couldn't. The library, the entity, the shadows, they were behind her now. But as she moved through the empty streets, she couldn't escape the nagging thought that she hadn't truly left. Midnight had let her go, or had it simply let her carry it with her? A faint whisper rises, indistinct but deliberate, blending with the ticking clock. And as she walked away, the ticking of the clock followed her into the night. The ticking fades into silence. Midnight, a moment suspended in time, where secrets linger and shadows take form. Have you ever felt it? The quiet shift in the air, the sensation that something unseen was watching. Perhaps you've stood at the edge of midnight, wondering what waited just beyond the dark. Share your stories. Tell us, what has midnight shown you? Who knows, your tale might be the spark that brings the next story to life. But beware, midnight isn't just an hour, it's a promise that it will return, because midnight comes for everyone, eventually. Subscribe now, so you don't miss out on our next spin chilling creepy story. Thank you for listening.